You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Podcast Network. Find all of our shows at wearelibertarians.com.
I see you looking at me.
Can I have your attention, please? Yes, hi, Wanda Sykes here. You ever think about all the nicknames we have for breasts? Boobs, tatas, the girls, chesticles, bubbies. Heck, you might even have your own nickname for them. And yet, even though they get so much attention, they're still so ignored when it matters most. What's up with that? Well, on February 9th, tune in to see why I'm talking so much about breasts and visit yourattentionplease.com to learn more.
You found your person. Now let the Knot help you with everything else. The Knot connects you to the wedding inspo, vendors, venues, and planning tools you need to make your day totally you. Having helped plan 25 million weddings, we've got your back when it comes to every little detail like RSVPs, budgets, and more. Because your wedding comes to life with the connections that matter the most. Get started at theknot.com/audio. The Knot. Let's plan your wedding together.
You're listening to the We Are Libertarians Network. Find more great shows like this at wearelibertarians.com. Welcome to We Are Libertarians. This is another edition of The Swamp Explained, where we get together with our good friend Rob Quartel, who is a 45-year fly on the wall in Washington, D.C., and Rob has worked for Republican presidential campaigns like George H.W. Bush and Gerald Ford. He's worked for government agencies like the EPA and has been confirmed by the Senate to the U.S. Federal Maritime Commission. He's also been a candidate for Congress and Senate, and he spent years working in the private technology sector working with startup companies. Now, given his experience and his iconoclastic viewpoints, Rob gives us great insight into the swamp and what makes up our nation's capital. And, it's been 2 weeks since Ruth Bader Ginsburg passed away. It's been 6 days since the taxes kerfuffle. It's been 4 or 5 days since the white supremacy debate stuff. We'll talk about some of that, but I mean, it's like lower on the list now. It's every day, Rob, is a new news cycle by the end of the day.
Well, which of those is the October surprise?
I don't. And the Hollywood Access tape, and then was the October 7th, and then the WikiLeaks stuff was October 8th. So Bush at the DUI was 4 or 5 days before the election. Like we're not done. There's 30 days till the election. We're nowhere near done.
I think that's right. But we've had a lot of surprises in the last 2 weeks, including the president. Of course, now that's not a surprise.
This is the least surprising outcome. I mean, they've been fairly reckless. Just to kind of document some of the recklessness that's been taking place. You know, they had the big Rose Garden event, no masks, where Coney Barrett was announced, and that allegedly is where this all kind of entered the White House inner circles. Then they go to the debate, and the family, even though it was in the rules, the family all declined to wear masks. You have coming back from on Wednesday from a rally in Minnesota, Hope Hicks starts feeling symptomatic, and they quarantine her. She tests positive the next morning. Trump completely ignores that he's been exposed and goes to a fundraiser with 50 people where some of these donations were $250,000. Those 50 people are freaking out. It's just a continual, like, Donald Trump is 74, overweight, doesn't take good care of himself. Like he takes an aspirin every day. Like there's a sense of invincibility, and it was never going to happen to us that has caught up with them.
It's interesting. I read an article somewhere, I can't remember, in the last 2 or 3 days, that when he was a kid, they went to a church that was run by Norman Vincent Peale.
He was,
I mean, I'm paraphrasing, but it's things are always better than they seem. And you can make things better by starting to believe they're better. I mean, I'm not giving him his due purpose, but he was essentially an optimist.
Right.
And we tend to, I'd never read that or heard that anywhere. And we tend to assume everything about Trump is Machiavellian or ignorant or something else. But, it may well be, there may be a grain of truth in that, in his upbringing. And, some religions seem a little darker and than others. But Peale was a very optimistic glasses half full kind of guy. And of course, I remember George H.W. Bush, from the beginning, first time I ever met him, it was, I believe some people believe the glass is half empty. I believe the glass is half full. And of course, you would hope that would be tempered by some rational activities outside of it. But you get a little hint of that in his conversations.
When you control fate through the force of your will, in his mindset, nothing can touch you.
Yeah, but I doubt anyone's surprised, and it is irresponsible, and it's not just personally irresponsible, but it has an impact, of course, on the whole governance of the United States, and everybody's in a tizzy, and we really, to this, obviously we all hope he gets well and he has a mild case, and Melania too, but you have no idea where this disease will go. Boris Johnson had a fairly early, easy week and did some work first week, and then he just collapsed in a 3-hour period, and they ended up, in the hospital, sort of a near-death experience. And so let's just hope that doesn't happen with the president. So
anyway, it's the cytokine storm comes in, and your immune system starts attacking that, and it starts to build
overreaction,
overreaction, and that overreaction from your immune system can start to attack your heart, your lungs. Then you have the oxygen depletion, and the oxygen depletes from your other organs. So that's why there's 95% comorbidities.
But unlike other Americans, he gets remdesivir, and he gets a cocktail made by one of the major pharmaceutical companies of antibodies.
300 people have had that test, that cocktail.
That cocktail, right? And Regeneron, which, by the way, is a terrific, terrific company. They, the guy who's been on the news, they're one of their two founders. We know, not personally incredibly well, but we do know well enough from, he used to be, his company now sponsors what used to be the Westinghouse Science Fair. And my wife serves on the board of the company that runs that, or did serve on it. And they're just a great sponsor. And, the Science Fair, they give out like $250,000 to the number one high school student winner. And then they give out 150, and then several 100s, and then a bunch of 50s. I mean, it's an incredibly generous program. But anyway, so Regeneron, which is a very interesting pharma company, and so it's not like he's at the hands of,
Yeah, I guess it irritates me.
Hydrochloroquine.
Yeah, which, boy, is that debate settled, because that's not on his list of treatments.
Yeah.
When push came to shove, he wasn't prescribed it and is not taking it. I guess.
But of course, there's a cascade of things that people are talking about here.
Well, let me say this. It's frustrating, going back to what we talked about last episode, that Donald Trump is able to have a test and has access to as many tests, and his entire team has, and it's very hard. And I've not talked about it on the show, but like I was told by an IU telehealth nurse in April that I likely had it based on my symptoms, and I can tell you that I wasn't able at the time to get a test. It was $900, and I would have loved to have the ability to have testing every day, but they failed at it. And, he has access to it, and they haven't been doing that. Why did it take so long for them to really catch up with this stuff?
Well, the more irresponsible part is that they knew Hope Hicks had it, and yet he went ahead and did the other fundraisers.
Which is what really chaps people's behinds, because it's the lack of sympathy, it's the lack of responsibility, it's the lack of care and concern for other people. And so when this hits, I heard one guy on CNN who was a voter in Wisconsin say, I don't want him to die, but I sure hope he learns a lesson. And
they're going to still vote for him.
Right.
No, totally. Yeah. I don't, if this changes the election one jot, it will be to help him.
Yeah.
Obviously they're going to probably have to miss the next presidential debate. I guess the vice presidential debate is next Wednesday, this coming Wednesday. And so that'll be quite something to see. And both of them have tested negative, but But it's a great example of the swamp in motion, though, all around this. There are discussions about, well, what if he gets sick and can't, what if he goes into, much sicker, and how does that translate into power? And then if he all of that kind of stuff. And then, of course, if he had to drop out, they're already talking about what are the rules of the Republican Party and the states. And so it is a cascade of big questions. And of course, all of them are focused on him. So as he likes to dominate the media. So there you go. But
so in the wake of the Kennedy assassination, we'll jump into the 25th Amendment, because people are probably wondering what happens next. And so after the Kennedy assassination, Indiana Senator Birch Bayh spearheaded one of the 3 amendments that he championed. The third did not make it, which was the something to do with women's equality. You may remember the name of it, but
ERA. The
ERA, yes, great show on Phyllis Schlafly that surrounding that. But essentially, what happens is this has happened 3 times. Reagan, in his administration, had a cancer surgery and was under anesthesia, and he signs a letter to the Senate Pro Tem and the House Speaker saying the Vice President's in charge, and then he takes that power back with a second
Except
letter.
Al Haig said he was in charge.
Well, that was the shooting, and so they didn't invoke it then. And you may fill people in, because 81 keeps coming up, and I was born in 83. What happened when President Reagan was shot and under anesthesia in 81 and Al Haig? Can you explain that?
Well, I think it's probably less dark than everybody. Haig was he was a tough military guy, very authoritarian. He may have been the Supreme Allied Commander or something, or certainly NATO, but and Secretary of State and this and that. And he was Chief of Staff. And when Reagan was rushed to the hospital, of course, everybody's asking questions about what's going on. And he stands up in front of the camera and says, "I am in charge here." And what he might have meant was, "I'm in charge of the White House staff." But he was not in charge there. And George Bush had a greater sense of propriety, and he never said, "I was in charge" about anything. Mm-hmm. And he kind of went about the business until Reagan went under surgery, and he signed the letter, and the power was shifted in theory anyway to George H.W. Bush, who I'm sure the nuclear football was shifted over too at the same time, and as soon as Reagan came out, that was shifted back, and Bush never said I was in charge at all.
Wasn't he somewhere on a vacation? Wasn't he somewhere on a vacation or something? He was not readily available, or not in DC, and that's why Haig.
He may have been at Kenny Bunkport.
Yeah, and that's who's in charge right now, and I'm in charge.
Yeah. So I don't think Haig was quite as nefarious as he's been given credit for, or criticized for, but it was a powerful moment, and it forever tarred his image, and I'm sure Reagan didn't much like it either, when he came out of everything. So, but that was a very good case of the 25th Amendment working. And I know, it seems to me it's been used several times since. I think, I can't remember whether it was, Bush 41 may have had some medical operation. I can't remember now, but it's been used since.
Bush had 2 colonoscopies and transferred it.
That's right.
And
that's
so
right.
now
W had him. Yeah.
Here's the thing. So now Reagan, the Bushes, Clinton, Obama, if they're under anesthesia, they're in this situation, they're probably drawing up the letter. Let's be prepared. Let's go through all these eventualities. I don't think there's anybody that expects Donald Trump to sign that letter or understand what that letter means. And,
right.
And Pence, is he going to be willing, let's say the president, like Boris Johnson, is, on a ventilator and unable to perform his duties for a week or two? Is Mike Pence going to make a move with the rest of the cabinet? Because if the president doesn't, the cabinet and the vice president can sign the letter to the Congress. Is Mike Pence, all of a sudden Trump comes back and then he feels the fury of usurping his power. Donald Trump is not the type of person who is willing to clearly, after talking about deleveraging your belief in your ballot. He's not the type of guy just to willingly hand over power. So I wonder how that plays out. Have you thought about, Pence? Does he have the guts? What happens?
Well, there are a couple different things here. There's the part where if the president willingly transfers it, and then there's the part where he unwillingly transfers it, and then either because he is incapacitated sufficiently that he can't make the decision, or if the cabinet chooses to decide that he is unable to execute the office. So there are three parts to the amendment. One is sort of the succession. So if the president, if the cabinet, basically the vice president and eight of the secretaries put it in writing, the president is unable to execute the office and send that to the Speaker of the House or the President pro tem, which is on the Senate side, then the vice president immediately takes on the president's powers, but he becomes acting president. So the elected president hasn't lost office yet or anything like that, but he can then come back and say, the president can say, I'm able to take it over. And he sends a letter to the House and to the Senate saying that I'm not unable to perform my duties. And once that is, then they get their power back in 4 days, unless that, the vice president and the 8 cabinet officers say again that he is not able. So there's a time. And if that happens, then the Senate has to jump into the deal to settle the dispute. So
right,
a number of contingencies. It's sort of a complicated amendment, and it would be hard to imagine. But think about, there was this whole conversation early on in the Trump administration about so many of the cabinet secretaries and others were just appalled and shocked, and was there going to be a palace coup? And of course there was not, but had there been, they would have used this as a vehicle for the coup.
We talked about the 25th Amendment and his mental fitness at the time. I wonder if like a Chad Wolf, who's an acting secretary, would they count? Because
no, he would not, because I'm sure I can't imagine that he would be considered. And if it's 8, that means it must be 2/3 plus 1 of the cabinet. So.
Yeah, this secession stuff has come up a lot because, in the forthcoming episode that we're going to do talking about the Bart Gellman and the Atlantic article, one of the scenarios is, can the Republicans throw this into chaos to the point that they go past the deadline that's set in a constitutional amendments for the electors, and then all of a sudden you end up with a scenario in January where Nancy Pelosi's the president.
Well, you could.
Yeah, it's really crazy.
Well, and back, in sort of the thematically the swamp, there's a whole lot of activity going around all of these threads of governance. So I think most people probably don't know that if it does go to the House, that if the electors can't agree, that, you have an election. Each state has a number of electors based on population and a number of congressional seats and Senate seats and all that and blah, blah, blah. And if they cannot agree, and that is up in December, mid to late December is when they meet.
So, for instance, if Pennsylvania is really tight, they cast out, the ballots are all fake, so we need the Trump electors, but the Biden electors have been seated because they properly won according to the certified election. But now you've got 40 people instead of 20 that are electors from Pennsylvania, and then all of a sudden, now what do you do?
Well, and then probably, and I don't know for sure, but I wouldn't be surprised if the other electors get to decide who gets seated, not unlike the Congress can do something similar. But we will be having a lot of these fights in courts, and of course that's why the administration wants to have the 9th Justice, Amy Coney Barrett, in place, because they're just assuming that she will vote with them. I don't think that's a natural assumption. Yeah. There have been other instances where I think the true conservative point of view would not be what they're assuming. But in any case, let's say the electors, for all the various reasons, can't reach an agreement. Then it goes to the House, and everybody sort of assume. Well, by the way, on the electors, people need to be aware that more states are now splitting the electors in any case based on proportionate vote. So there are a couple states that if the president gets 3 of the congressional seats and Biden gets 2, they're going to split the electors proportionately to reflect that. That's not in the Constitution, but the states are all able under the Constitution to pick electors their own way. And that's where this is going to go to state courts first, in the instance you talked about with Pennsylvania. But again, if it goes to the House, everybody may assume that it's proportionate by, per congressman, everyone gets a vote. But that is not the way it works. It is every state gets 1 vote. And so you have to take the whole of the delegation. And if the delegation is, more Democrats and Republicans, they're obviously their 1 vote's going to go for Biden and vice versa. And right now, despite the fact that Republicans are in minority, they control more state delegations. So in this category, the swamp, and everybody, all these creatures doing their own thing, there's a whole separate thread of people out there who are working very hard, particularly on the Democratic side, to make sure they can tip over enough state delegations that they would win in the event of it going to the House. So this is very complicated, and this is a great example of the swamp at work in ways that most people never see.
The gap between what we think government is and how it operates, because we watch television, we read, blogs, really people just kind of glean from their social media what's going on. That is so far disconnected from how things work. The legality, the legal struggles that we've just covered in the first 20 minutes here, each one of like the Supreme Court, for instance, I think people glean off of social media that, of course, we've got 6 justices and they've got 3, so these 6 justices are going to go our way. But in the legal system, in law, like we said last time, there's no guarantee that, Coney Barrett will recuse herself, Justice Thomas will be with you, but Kavanaugh, Alito, and Roberts vote against Trump. I think people think that they're guaranteed votes and they're rooting for this Supreme Court nomination like it's a team sport, and it's not in the law. That's right. You look at Texas, for instance, and really the voting stuff illustrates a lot of this. Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, Florida, Texas, you've got all these lawsuits by the Republican Party trying to use the law and existing case law to erode the ability for people to vote because they think that if more people vote, it helps the Democrats. So you've got Texas Governor Abbott, Republican, limiting the amount of ballot drop-offs to 1 per county. Well, there's there's
counties that are huge.
Yeah, Travis County with Austin, all of Austin. Yeah. I mean, it's insane.
Yeah, well, and I do think that's actually deliberate. I think that's, it does remind me of, it's a different topic. Sometime we can talk about it. Black Lives Matter. I personally do not believe we are an inherently racist society, but I do think there are many things which play out racially that are in the law, which we're not aware of, some of which are deliberate and some of which are not. For example, the real estate law in New York, that basically taxed black properties black neighborhoods more heavily than white neighborhoods. That's clearly a bias. But what they're doing in Texas, in my opinion, is absolutely intended to reduce the vote of Latinos and other minorities in Texas. And
who has a car to drive to the box and who doesn't have a car to drive to the box?
Totally. It's a kind of poll tax in its own way. Yeah. Which has been outlawed, as we well know, in the Constitution. But there's so many things in this cascade. So, there's what happens if Trump drops out, in terms of the government itself. Then there's the whole election. What happens there? Well, the Republican National Committee, it doesn't just pass to Pence. The Republican National Committee would have to meet, and that is proportionate, and vote on who would represent who would be the nominee of the party. And then, of course, they got to try to figure out somehow to get it on the ballot in all these states. And each state has its own ballot procedures and printing. And we started absentee voting how many weeks ago now? It's been 10 days, a week and a half, 2 weeks ago. So
Let me read something from the Atlantic. Rules exist for what could come next, but they won't prevent total chaos. This is by a guy who wrote, the author of this article wrote a book on the 25th Amendment and wrote this article on what happens next. So he writes, there's no real possibility of delaying the election that would require legislation from the House, the Senate, and the President agreeing quickly on new dates. So that's out. It's too late to reprint the ballots. Not only have millions of people voted already, but the process of printing and distributing is simply too time-consuming, and I'd also add too expensive. The law recognizes that at a certain point the ballots say what they say, even if they're no longer accurate. It would be crucial for the party replacing a candidate to broadcast its choice to the public with speed and clarity. And so, as perhaps more important, the party would need to coordinate its electoral college designees, the people who cast the actual electoral vote. So they'd have to whip all those delegates to vote for Pence, let's say, so it goes to the parties. So the DNC or the RNC calls, they select the candidate. They say, they publicly declare this is our candidate. Then you basically have to hope that people vote for that candidate, and then the electoral college votes for that. So all the people want to abolish the Electoral College. This is another example of that check and balance on shenanigans. And
that's right.
That people need to be aware of. Let's say Trump tries to steal the election, or something happens and Pence is the ballot. And it's another layer of protection for the public. You get rid of the Electoral College.
It's a great example of why direct election is problematic.
Yes.
Yeah. No, I agree. But so you get the party thing, and then of course there are all the other effects, the cascade, which we sort of talked about in other things here. The two of the senators who are key on the House, the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is going to review the Supreme Court nominee and recommend her to the full Senate, have COVID. Yeah. And they were going to start hearings in the next 2 weeks. Well, they can't do that if they're under the weather. Maybe they'll be fine, maybe be a mild case. They could certainly participate in that sense. But of course, as someone pointed out in, I think, the Washington Post this morning, McConnell, the Senate Majority Leader, doesn't have to have a committee recommendation. He can just send it to the floor if he wants.
Yep.
And that would be procedurally bad, but
he said today they're going to do a Zoom hearing, which, and then Chuck Schumer tweeted out, it is irresponsible and dangerous to move forward with a hearing, and there is absolutely no good reason to do so. So you've now got 3 senators, 2 of which are on the Judicial Committee, based on your reckless behavior, that are every senator that falls is another 2 to 3 week delay on this. And it's their fault, but they're going to blame the Democrats, and everybody will go along with it. And they've now put Amy Coney Barrett's nomination at risk. Let's say Biden wins and they try to approve her during a lame duck session. That makes the legitimacy crisis even worse.
Yeah. But I think if we were to predict, I think let me make one prediction. If something did happen to Trump and he couldn't be on the ballot, or he were to die, or he be incapacitated in some way, I'm not sure that there wouldn't be a fight over the nominee, because there are some very aggressive senators out there, including Rubio and what's his name from Texas, Ted
Cruz,
Cruz, and a couple others, but those two would be fighting it out.
Yeah.
So, the question is going to be who's the most Trumpian. That would probably be Cruz, I guess. But
yeah,
but there would be. I think it'd be a fight. But in any case, assuming it isn't, I think the reality is the election is going to go ahead. I think that Barrett will be approved. I do think I don't think the hypocrisy argument has had much sway, because frankly, most Americans think all politicians are hypocrites. So exhibiting a little more hypocritical behavior doesn't make them any more hypocritical than they were before.
Right.
So, and the reality, part of me thinks the Democrats should be playing the card that, it was perfectly legal on Constitution for Obama to nominate Merrick Garland. And it's perfectly legal, unfortunately, for Trump to nominate Barrett, because they're president and Obama was president. What the Republicans did was bad and evil, and and the Democrats can't do anything other than ask questions. So there's some aspect of me which thinks they should just take the position that what the Republicans did under Obama was wrong, and it's not so wrong for Trump because he does have that right. And no one could possibly expect Trump to step back, even if he loses and Barrett is not confirmed by that point. I fully don't expect he would ever step back.
He was totally right in the debate when he goes, "You guys would do it too."
Yeah, totally, completely. So anyway, it's kind of crazy. What can happen next, right?
So, I mean,
and of course, the taxes just sort of went over people's heads.
Oh, yeah. Jonah Goldberg tweeted out, he goes, "Next weekend, you will look back on this weekend with fond memories of how peaceful and calm it was," or something along that line.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, I don't think the tax thing bothers anybody.
Really?
I think that Trump should have done a better job of talking about it. I think one of his better lines that got eaten up there was, "You wrote the laws, Joe." And that happens to be true. That he was certainly one who voted for them, and anyone and frankly, what he should have said was, if you were a business guy and ever run a business, Joe, you would know that sometimes you have losses and sometimes you have earnings, and the two get offset against each other. But anyway, he didn't, and he's not one for great explanations. But I think it didn't change one vote anywhere. And
yeah, the taxes thing, I think, so the New York Times article that was the quote-unquote bombshell article basically said at one point that he was the greatest tax deductor in American history, or like in one year he had written off more than any other American, which ever which, there's part of me goes, nice. And then
of course, the other side,
the other side goes, when you continually advocate and excuse a person working in the gray area, eventually that isn't a good look, because it just looks like you're allowing criminality. And there's nothing so far that anybody's claimed is criminal, but it does show it did give me another dimension to Trump, in that the amount of debt that he has, the amount of personal guarantees that are coming due, the amount of people that he owes that are unnamed, it almost gave a sense of, okay, now all these stories are sort of fitting together, that Trump has to maintain the office, because if he leaves the office, he's going to have all these investigations, he's going to have all these $100 million back tax payments, he's using the White House travel office essentially as guaranteed room nights. In the tax returns, you see the revenue to the hotels and golf courses every year he's president drop dramatically because the brand has been damaged. And so for him, it's less about some grand vision of what he wants to do for America in a second term, but more political and financial preservation in winning the office. And I don't think that that's necessarily a winning message for people.
Well, I think your analysis is correct, that he feels he would fundamentally be safer in the presidency, and I suspect this has cost him an awful lot of money. It's a sort of a Potemkin's village of financial genius, but he could have gone for a long time, never having moved to Washington with that, and played with an awful lot of money and never been the target of any investigation, serious investigation.
Yeah, sorry to cut you off, but it sort of validates the rumor that he just did this in 2015, 2016. The Apprentice was ending. He had made $606 million on it. He needed to gin up. He had just bought all these properties, and he wanted to gin up the brand a little bit, create a little national presence. But he never thought he'd win.
And never thought it would undermine the brand. But
it's the worst business decision
I think
he
where
made.
he's gonna, but where he has created a brand, and I heard I was on a Doug Brinkley, who's the famous presidential historian. I'm on the humanities board at Rice University, where I went as an undergrad, and Brinkley is a professor there, and he was talking about this. He pointed out that if he loses, he may be chased to the ends of the earth with these lawsuits and tax suits and everything else, and kind of the question that was raised was, is that a good thing? And he reminded everyone that, of course, after Nixon resigned, and there were cries for his further incarceration and chopping him into teeny little bits and everything else. Ford, after I think 2 or 3 days, decided to pardon him.
Yeah,
and he knew at the time that it would have huge political implications for him, Ford. But as he said, it was time to heal the wounds of the nation. And I think one big question would be if Biden were to win. And again, I am not predicting that. Everybody will get my last prediction the week before they would do a show right before the election. But I think he will be faced with exactly the same issue. And it's, people like the House members who chased him through the impeachment, they're still desperate for their pound of flesh. And maybe they should get it, but I do not think that will help heal the country in any way. I don't expect the country to be healed, but I think Biden will be trying to reach out to the 45 or 7% of the voters who voted for Trump, because if he doesn't, it's not going to tamp things down.
Well, if Joe Biden is reportedly not running for a second term and is already a lame duck president, and he's likely not to get much done politically, if it is true that not prosecuting Donald Trump, and I tend to think that, yes, giving him blanket immunity as Ford did to Nixon is probably the right move historically, but in the moment, not good politically, because Biden's already going to be weak president. He's going to be attacked by the left, sort of like Carter was, I believe, where it's just he may be the sacrificial lamb in a lot of respects. I mean, so I could see him doing it on those grounds.
Yeah. Well, I think he would want the news not to be dominated by Donald Trump for the next 4 years. And that's exactly what would happen. And I think the other thing that Brinkley predicted, that if he lost, he would, particularly if something like that happened, he would fade away into history as the worst president, in modern times. And I do not think so. I think that he will lead a political party and a new party, and I would not be surprised if Donald Jr. or Ivanka was on the ballot in 2024 for president. So I think we have not seen the last of Trump. Fortunately, I don't think Donald Jr. is quite as smart as his dad.
Well, you remember the famous, somebody was comparing and contrasting fatherhood, where Biden's, tearing up about his sons all the time, and then Trump, when he walks into the delivery room, his mom goes, "Oh, it's a boy, and I want to name him Donald Jr." And his response was, "What if he's a loser?"
Yeah, right. That's exactly right.
And the Daily did
and he sort of was. He was,
yeah.
And has been. It's he would never have made anything on his own. So he liked to hunt and fish and all that, and he probably would have been happier had he been able to do it. But
the Daily podcast did a great breakdown on Don Jr. But yeah, I think you're right. The Trumpism, it will be around for a generation. It's not going back into the bottle. I think there's, will Trump run again if he loses? Probably, but I don't think that he'd even make it through the primary. I think if he loses, people will be
No, I think if he loses, the Republican Party per se is done with him.
Yeah, the fundamental question is, can you handle 4 more years of this? And I think if he goes and you break the fever, everybody's going to go, I never want to go back to that. I'll take Ted Cruz. Like, you look at this and you go, oh, I miss George Bush. Even Ted Cruz would have been better. Can you imagine thinking that 4 or 5 years ago?
No. Well, no, I think it's contemplating 4 more years is pretty awful. But as I think we touched on last time, I do think that and Brinkley did this masterful job, and his books are wonderful about the presidency. He wrote a great one about Cronkite. He wrote a terrific one about going to the moon. But he went through the sort of the history of presidencies and the rise and fall of populism and all this in a hour and a half conversation with all of us. And um, this populism is something that is not just going to go away. I mean, the notion somehow the government has gotten to a size that it's not solving a bunch of problems. And so, Obama sort of promised to break some China, but didn't break a lot, and sort of was sucked into the swamp and of the Democratic side of the left of center side of the swamp, and the institutions that have been here forever. And I've spoken before about the George Bush was being accused of being a one-worlder because he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations and the Trilateral Commission, whatever one-worlder happens to be. But I do think that there are just many institutions that were and have been ripe for change. And the one that, of course, that caused the biggest stir initially was Trump's answers on NATO. And NATO has existed virtually unchanged since the end of the last World War. So that's a long time. And it was ripe to be broken. And I think the relationship with China and all of us have known how bad it is underneath, and that they seem to have the tactical advantage, and breaking that is probably fine. That's a good thing. And, you can go down this list of organizations and institutions, and Trump is certainly not the first guy to use executive power, overuse it. Obama was rebuffed by the courts at the end of his term on the coal regs. He basically issued the coal regs by fiat, and the court in the end said that was an abuse of executive power. And the left of center folks tend to forget that. And Trump has carried it enough to an extreme that I do think there will be, after the election, no matter who wins, there'll be a movement to restrict, or let's just say bring the powers of the Congress back to where they should be, and the powers of the president back to where they should be. And they were supposed to be in more balance. Now, whether that makes sense in a world like ours is an entirely different question. It's not clear to me that you want a president so hamstrung that he can't react to threats, immediately. And I don't think people are seriously talking about that, but they need more reporting functions and all that. So I think what at the end of this, if Biden were to win, he would have a great opportunity to reset the clock on a whole bunch of institutions and things that we take for granted. Our international relations have been ripe for resetting. And they've not really ever had a kind of an overhaul since the fall of the Berlin Wall under Bush 1. And so he's going to be handed all this. We see it as damage, but he's going to be handed basically an open field with a bunch of China on it to run, if he became president. And now he's never been right, in my opinion, on almost any foreign policy.
That's my point. That's what I was going to say, is that when you examine his foreign policy, just instincts, it's everything. Yeah. Everything is the opposite of what has worked over 40 years. And this is the crazy thing about sort of the right's embrace of Trump and not understanding the long-term damage to their own interests. You see this with something like the census. All the libertarians and conservatives don't want to do the census because of, QAnon conspiracies or whatever. Well, all you're going to do is reapportion more Democratic House seats in blue states. You have Donald Trump doing, we don't like China, so you withdraw from TPP, which was a fundamental safeguard against China. It was trying to draw business away from China towards Vietnam and Taiwan. With Trump not filling the government, you're now going to have Biden fill out all of these generational bureaucratic seats with a bunch of people from the Center for American Progress. The long-term institutional damage that Donald Trump has done for the right, because people are so fed up with them, hurts the right. And it's seen as some sort of bizarre win that he's like, he has been great in terms of foreign policy, for instance. He put the nail in the coffin, I think, in the idea that we should be intervening in other nations. And I think that it was already drawing down under Obama, but Donald Trump forced the right to take a look at their own beliefs about it, to the point where like a Jonah Goldberg is going, I was wrong about Iraq, I was wrong about all this. So Donald Trump has been really positive in some ways, but to the long-term interest of people on the right, he's done a lot of damage, and it's really sort of interesting to watch people do things that are counter to their own interests.
Well, I do think that a lot of what he's done is very reflective of what the public actually feels.
Yeah, right.
And that is counter to what the so-called experts would recommend. So TPP, was, I certainly thought it was a great idea, and I agree with your analysis. And I had friends working on it inside the Obama administration, and it was bipartisan. But I suspect it would not have dealt with the core issues in China, which is that it simply flouts the rules.
Yeah.
And we allow it to do that inside an international organization where we all have to follow the rules. And because we are who we are, we do. So the fact that Trump has broken that is probably a good thing. You mentioned the wars. Well, Americans historically hate wars, yet we have become more and more, you've heard the phrase, the world's policeman. And we really, first of all, it's a massive resource drain. And second of all, it's a political, it really reduces our flexibility politically. It's not to say we should become isolationists, but we need to choose our battles more carefully. And I think he's upended that. And again, I'm on the Council on Foreign Relations, as I've said. And so everybody's wringing their hands because they're pulling out of Iraq and this and that. And we don't have soldiers. We're not going to have them in Europe. And you think about it. Do the soldiers really create any resistance for the Russians crossing into France or Poland or anything else anymore? A small group, a group of 1,000 Americans would be enough to create a political resistance.
He's totally right on that. And why are we paying so much more in the United Nations and NATO? He's right on all that stuff.
Well, I frankly would love to see the United Nations become an actual forum. I think the promise of that it's always promises, never action. So it would be great if countries actually believed that they could talk out their problems. But frankly, most of them don't want to do it in public in any case, and that's what the UN is.
Well, yeah. So he's been good and bad on a lot of this stuff, but
that's right.
Things like beating up on our allies, for instance, as he's weakened a lot of different allyships and strengthened the hand of the Chinese and Russians. You look at a potential where a president is incapacitated, or we have a crisis of our elections. Like, that's game on for Iran, for North Korea, for China, for Russia. That's not necessarily good for America's interests. So it's good and it's bad. But Donald Trump has some characteristics that I think are great. And it's his lack of, he just doesn't care, right? He just doesn't, frankly...
but I do think it's an expression of popular will, though.
Yes, he does. He identifies issues that people care
about. That's where the conflict comes when you read the New York Times or the Wall Street, less so the Wall Street Journal, but the New York Times, the Washington Post, or any of the major newspapers. They're representative of a societal point of view that his supporters are challenging, and it's not they're not necessarily wrong for challenging. I mean, the question you really have is, what do you put in its place ultimately?
He's got an incredible threshold for pain that most politicians wouldn't, and he wouldn't have been able to break a lot of those foreign policy problems if he didn't have that instinct. You know, and that's right. I think has been, you're never going to get a Ted Cruz or really any other politician that could have done that. Now it's been done. Do we need it to continue before he changes his mind? And
yes, we don't need a bull anymore. We need somebody who's the repair person.
Right.
Yeah. So.
We should talk about the debate. I mean, I won't use the phrase "who won," but I think Trump lost it and Biden didn't win it. What were your impressions?
Well, what was it? One of the commentators, the woman said it was a shit show right on the air. I didn't see all of it, frankly. I saw the last 25 minutes, and I thought to myself, "Thank God it's ending." And I'm not sorry I missed the first part. And of course, the reporting is. I think largely people believe Trump lost it, but there are a few people who think he did exactly what he needed to do against Biden which was to show that he's the man in charge. He's the alpha male in this group, and that's what appeals to a lot of supporters. So
yeah, he got which is totally undermined by now having COVID, but
yeah,
he wanted to rattle Biden, get his Irish up, and he got it. And you noticed if you watch the debate, after he gets Biden to say "shut the hell up, man," he kind of stops with a lot of the interruptions. But Trump early on in the debate looked in command of the facts, and I even remember thinking, wow, this is the most articulate and fact-filled version of Donald Trump I've ever seen, and I was impressed. And then he started the bad behavior, and it totally turned me off. And there were times where that constant talking, Biden didn't look in command of the facts. He did look confused at certain points. He didn't do well. He did look tired. And if Donald Trump had shut up and gotten out of his own way, that would have come through. But he had to bully and piss Chris Wallace off. And I mean, they broke poor Chris. He started, like at one point, he started screaming. So I look at it and I go, again, just like with COVID and Coney Barrett and what we said earlier, he just can't help himself and get out of his own way.
I read a fair amount of the quotes from the early part of the debate, which I missed, that I missed watching visually. And I actually had a similar reaction to what you just said, which is that I was surprised at how articulate some of these things were.
Yeah.
Now, he also had one passage there, and I can't quote it exactly, but we've talked about this before, which is that he said, my election has never been accepted by the left. First Hillary, then everybody else, and all of these things. He said, the day after the election, they already were trying to impeach me before I was sworn in.
Yeah.
And all this stuff has, I think it is true that and this is the swamp, the intelligentsia, the establishment, whatever you want to call it, and immediately shocked, surprised, and reacting. And the Republicans did some of that to Obama, but it wasn't quite as overt most of the time. It was just, we want to unelect him, come the next election, and Republicans lost on that. But so I think Trump feels and felt that he has been under attack since before he even moved into the White House, and that will certainly color your reactions to everything. But I like you, I thought a number of the answers early on were pretty articulate. I don't think the parts I saw made Biden look so, weak. Although, what I was seeing live later were all the excerpts that the left of center media, right, as opposed to the right of center media, wanted me to see. Right. And I can't stand watching Fox. I probably should be going back to it right now just to see how they report the same thing. But
yeah, the reality is Biden had some good moments. He had, I thought when he basically, there were reports out that Trump wanted to attack Bo's military service, and
right,
Biden went on the offensive and talked about that to lure him into talking about it, and Trump took the bait and talked about Hunter instead. But it just made him look really insensitive. And then there were, for all the talk about Wallace set Donald Trump up, like there were plenty of times where on the white supremacy question, Wallace moved on and didn't let the president hang himself. And if Wallace really wanted to screw him, he could have just shut up. Wallace really, who was in an unfortunate position and is taking way more criticism than he deserves.
Yeah, I agree.
And just sounded downright defeated the next day.
Well, so the next one, it's going to be interesting. There's all this hand wringing about, well, can they be in two separate rooms? Well, what people don't remember, not many of us alive, but the Nixon Kennedy debates, one of those was from two separate studios.
Right. Yeah, you're right.
So it would certainly not be the first time, and it would be interesting. It would be interesting TV. And it would certainly be easier to control. I guess you'd have to have a split screen and be easier to shut somebody up. But I think turning off mics is going to be a very dangerous kind of thing.
That's a terrible idea.
people to do.
Terrible idea.
I mean, we'd love it, but I think it's a bad idea.
It will just this C-SPAN guy who's doing it. I don't know how he got this, but he's pictures with Biden sharing anti-Trump, David Brooks articles. So the reality is you don't want that mic being muted, because then it just opens you up to bias or whatever organization is putting on the debates. And so it's terribly fraught with danger. And then, I think people should see, if this is ugly, this is because this is what you've chosen as an American voting population. Yeah. Look at your ugliness. See what you've produced. But if I were on either one of these teams, I'm saying no more debates. I'm using the COVID thing to get out of the debate if I'm Trump, because there'll just be another white supremacy moment, which was horrifying and ugly. And then there'll be, Biden or Trump will figure it out and shut up and let Biden look weak and frail. And if I'm on either one of these teams, I'm just saying, let's move on. People, 95% of people who watched this debate said it didn't make up their mind. These aren't effective. They don't work.
Yeah. I agree. Yes, I agree with you completely. I was thinking about, by the way, one of the, I don't know if you've been, if you read political books, but there's a new book out on Jim Baker. He's sort of like the ultimate manipulator of the swamp. And I can't remember. It's by Peter Baker and Susan Glasser, and neither one of them is related. He's not related to Jim Baker, but he's a journalist, and she is too, two different organizations. And I guess she's at the New Yorker and he's at the New York Times, but it's about how a guy can come into what's essentially the swamp in a sort of a lesser position and learn to manage it and control it. And his personality is like that, and he's that kind of person, but he also believed that the purpose of politics was to actually do something. So he was willing to compromise and move things along bit by bit by bit. And there's some people who I think, I can't remember if it was Susan Rice or somebody was highly critical of him, saying, well, he should have done something about this and this, rather than looking at all the things that he did accomplish in that period of time. But that would be worth people reading. It's called, what is the name of it? It is The Man Who Ran Washington.
Yeah, he was James Baker. What titles did he hold? He was basically
he was
Reagan
Chief
needed
of Staff.
him. Yeah, Chief of Staff to Reagan, and Reagan was like, I need somebody to help. Reagan was an outsider and didn't know Washington, and Baker was the guy who helped get the insiders. Excuse me. What else?
He had to. He had to create a deal with Reagan's guys, none of whom had any experience running anything. So Baker had run. He'd been a minor official at Department of Commerce before Reagan, and then he was George H.W. Bush's campaign manager, and then later became it was a Joint Chiefs of Staff, and then it became, I can't remember, I guess he was Secretary of Treasury, Secretary of State, he was Secretary of State under George H.W. Bush when he became president, and just kind of a good all-around guy. I mean, watching him run meetings, there might be 25 people in the room, and he'd say, okay, I only want 10. And he'd kick everybody else out.
Really?
And yeah, because he wanted that. He didn't want to have to, he's very good at listening, but also very good at commanding. So, but the whole point, it was the art of power, and it was the art of recognizing the various rivers and parts of the swamp, and he just knew how to do it, and he really learned it.
Yeah, I assume you worked with him in '79. Did you know?
Oh yeah,
him?
yeah. And in fact, I mentioned in his book.
Really?
In the Ford campaign, yeah. In the Ford campaign, he was a campaign manager there, and I was head of what was called the answer desk, which was the equivalent of an issue operation. I think I've talked about it before. If you're in the campaign for an incumbent president, you really don't make policy. What you do is you make politics. You take
Right.
whatever their positions are, you try to meld them into some coherent political message. So later, when I was in a similar position with George H.W. Bush when he ran against Reagan, I actually was writing policy papers and pulling the experts together on that. But so Jim was the head of the Ford campaign, did a masterful job, was a master manipulator and deal maker. Getting those last votes in the convention was really tough, and we all breathed a sigh of relief that he was in charge.
Well, we've come to the end, and we cannot leave without talking about food. So I don't know
food.
if you've been to D.C., but what is happening in your world?
Food. I was in D.C. last week. One of the nice things I've talked about down here on the island on the Chesapeake Bay is fresh crabs and fish and all that. So we pulled in the crab pots yesterday. It was the end of the crab season. Lots of big male crabs, but also lots of females, which is a good sign for next year. And you throw the females back, of course. And then we've started to catch
How can you tell the difference? Lipstick or what?
Well, yeah, lipstick. Well, actually, that's not so off. The females have bright red claws at this time of year.
Okay.
And there's I hate to tell you, their parts, their organs are so that the males look sort of like the Washington Monument, and the females looks like the Capitol Dome.
Okay.
And that's all I'll say.
You never know what you're going to learn on this show.
Right. And then, we've been catching puppy drum. Finally, fishing's been terrible, but we were in DC last week. It was the first time my wife had been back since the 1st of March. And in our neighborhood, one restaurant, Chloe, which I've talked about before, is one of our favorites, is doing very well. It was as full as they can be at half capacity, and others just were not. And it was sad. RIS, which is one we invested in down in the West End, which is very good. But I think we were there with two of our friends, and that was about it. And then, so the restaurant scene is not come back, and the streets are pretty deserted downtown. The hotels are closed. The DC is a tourist town. Its budget is off by $300+ million this year, and that's largely because they've lost all the revenue from restaurants and hotels and tourism. So, but a couple restaurants have opened in this, including one new pizza place that's supposed to be terrific, Chicago-style pizza. So maybe on my next trip, I will do that. And then come the middle of October, we are traveling. We're taking a slow drive to Dallas to visit our daughter and granddaughter and husband. And we're going to hit Asheville for a couple days, and Memphis, and maybe Tulsa, although I point out that that's a hot spot, and then down to Bentonville, and then to Dallas by car, and then probably to Austin for a couple days, and then the wine country of Texas. So hopefully I'll have something to report right before the election about Texas wine, and some
fun.
Of which is okay. I wouldn't go beyond okay. So that's the food scene.
Well, Rob, thank you so much for joining me. It's always great to talk to you, and I'm sure between now and 2 weeks from now, 1,800 different things will have happened.
Absolutely. The next October surprise. It's great to chat.
All right. Thanks, Rob. We'll talk to you soon. Thank you to everybody for listening.